Hey looters, Limit for Ghouls here. I'm going to explain a bit about a build that I'd like to call the Engineer Mechanist. This is probably the easiest way to beat Torchlight 2 on Hardcore Elite, but I don't mean to discredit this build by any means. You'll still feel that nervous feeling you get when you are in tight corridors with 20 mobs chasing after you, but taking them on is definitely easier with this build. So to start off, I will say the main skill for this build are the spider mines. These tiny effective little babies are like heat-seeking missiles with an exploding punch. That means this build is slow getting started because you can't get spider mines until level 14. This is where skill respecs come in handy for my tip video. Until you get to level 14, you're going to want to use cannons, and investing a skill point into blast cannon at level 7 will really help. Once you get spider mines, just take off blast cannon and you're good to go. Before I go any further into other skills, I want to mention the stat distribution for this build. It varies on what gear you find in your playthrough, but for the most part, you should just go all into Vitality. The damage output for spider mines are minion based, a hidden damage modifier in this game that can only be tracked by adding the percentages up yourself. And just realizing that if you equip some gear that brings you up to plus 80% minion damage, then you're doing an assload of damage. That's why you don't need to put any points in strength. Now the reason I say it's dependent on the gear you find, you might also want to put a few points in dexterity every once in a while with the goal in mind of gaining it +1 to dodge every few levels. But for me personally, dodging didn't really play a factor when you're plowing so many points into Vitality that your high block chance becomes the more beneficial investment. Though I'm sure at level 60 plus when you've long past beaten the game and simply working on leveling for the sake of in-game grinding, the dodge probably plays a more important role. Especially since your block chance is capped at 50%. Eventually you'll be spending points for dexterity, I assume. But even after beating the game on Hardcore Elite, my character's block was still not at 50%. Back to talking about skills. As I mentioned earlier, at the start you'll want to go to the skill respec guy in town to take off your beginning skill. Add Healbot, Bulwark, and find a cannon at the blacksmith. Hopefully he has one. Healbot isn't very useful in my opinion at the start of the game, but once he gets his tier 2 bonus, Healbot is your best friend. He's like a George Foreman grill, just set him and forget him. Also, speaking of tier 2 bonuses, when you do get level 14, I would only put 1 point into spider mines, and don't worry about it until level 20. That's when you'll want to invest 4 skill points into it. If you noticed, the tier bonus for spider mines is a mana reduction for the skill. And adding skill points into spider mines without bringing it up to its tier 1 bonus will just result in spending more mana than you need to. As for Bulwark, that's pretty self-explanatory. You'll need all the defense you can get for the times that you actually do take damage, even though that won't be very many times once you pick up Forcefield at level 7, which is probably why Engineer is so amazing. As it sounds, the skill creates a force field around your character that can consume up to a certain amount of damage. It lasts for 30 seconds, and best of all, after you use it, it only has an 8-second cooldown. I mean, it literally absorbs pretty much anything from what I've noticed. I found myself absorbing traps and dungeons even. Though don't try it yourself, I don't think it's worth risking. I'll talk more about Forcefield in a moment. Once you've hit level 14, unless you've picked up some nice gear, you'll probably notice your mana isn't really in shape for all that spider mine spamming. This is why I recommend saving as many socketable gems as possible for Act 2, where you can transmute in an attempt to acquire mana regeneration gems and other gems you need. For me personally, I struggled a bit at the end of Act 1 and at the beginning of Act 2 because I couldn't sustain mana. I will add that Healbot for the most part does take care of mana regeneration due to its tier 2 bonus, but I found myself still needing some more mana regeneration. Your build picks up a little bit by Act 2 when you get Gunbot and Dynamo Field. Gunbot is just a bit of extra damage in tough fights, but Dynamo Field is the skill for building charge for the Mechanist. Building charge isn't super essential for this build, but take note that for every charge you have, Forcefield will be able to take lots more damage. So it's really good when you're at full charge and you hit that Forcefield skill. Really, you'll want to keep Forcefield on at all times, even without charges. I usually just use Forcefield without a charge and go into a pack spamming Dynamo Field to build charge for using Forcefield yet again. That way you don't take damage when building charge for what I like to call your Mega Shield. At level 21 you can pick up Onslaught for a movement skill. That's what I did, but I did not keep it. Movement skills are important in my opinion, so I used Onslaught until level 35 when I could then pick up Stormburst. It's all on preference, but I like Stormburst better, even if it has a 2-second cooldown. Then when level 28 comes around, you get Tremor. I personally felt this skill must play a bigger factor after beating the game, because until the moment I beat the game, I really only had to rely on this skill when there was tons of mobs crowding me, and even though I have Stormburst, this skill would cause the mobs to flee from me sometimes. But I would imagine this skill is most useful when its tier 3 bonus is added. The interrupt chance is great too, but I never found myself needing to interrupt anything casting due to keeping a distance from everything the entire game. At this point your build really doesn't change much until level 42, when you pick up Sledgebot and Immobilization Copter. In fact, at level 42, you'll start to realize how overpowered you really are when it comes to dishing out damage. Especially if you've been lucky enough to get some gear that complements your build, hopefully some nice pieces with minion damage, though I feel like this build could slip by without it. Now I would like to mention some areas to be cautious about in your playthrough, and this really applies to any build for Hardcore Elite. Towards the end of Act 1, the areas leading into Act 2, there are some nasty shamans with ice-based damage, so keep your distance, your force field up, and let your spider mines do their work. Kiting is your best friend in this build when you can. Sometimes kiting is a hard task in tight corridors though. You just have to find those openings and stick to using the walk only key as I mentioned in my previous video to get around mobs and avoid damage. Another enemy to be wary of in Act 2 is the lizard creatures you'll see. They have a spell or ability that stuns you. During my playthrough I was stunned a few times, and each time it was a very clutching moment. My Mechanist almost met her end each time. The next area is the Luminous Arena, near the end of Act 2. For the most part, relying on your movement skill can get you through this area with ease. I wouldn't worry about collecting everything here, just make it out alive. Luminous Arena wasn't too bad on my run, but the Arena of Slaughter in Act 3, however, was pretty tough. The area is pretty tight-knit, and it has some pretty tricky fire traps. Do your best to keep spamming spider mines, keep your force field up, and you should be fine. And of course using Sledgebot and Gunbot when you can. Another place to be careful is your fight with the Alchemist. Although for me I found this fight to be pretty easy. As long as you circle him at a nice distance, your spider mines along with your Gunbot and Sledgebot will just tear him up. The tedious part of this fight was really just dodging all the fire floor traps in each phase of the fight. But I figured it's still worth mentioning even if I found this fight easy. Lastly, the final boss. He's fairly easy as well, but once he gets to his last form, he has an attack that can summon giant rocks to fall on top of you. And they follow you wherever you go, of course. But the game made it very obvious when he's doing this attack. You will see him point his sword, and you'll hear a particular sound that always happens when he's going to summon the rocks. So that's pretty much all I have for this build. Just take your time, don't rush, and you should pull off a fairly easy Hardcore Elite win. I'll be posting step-by-step links to the build. Thanks for watching, happy looting, and feel free to subscribe.